Martha, 52, never planned to join Seattle's weirdest showdown, a time off. But when community garden potlucks turned frosty over stolen squash and side-eyes, she rolled up sleeves, plucked sprigs from her windowsill jar, and launched a wild idea: time sharing. No feuds, just fistfuls of fragrant green passed between porch stoops. By week's end, her gritty resilience had folks swapping pesto recipes instead of petty jabs. Oddball? Maybe. Lit? Absolutely. Turns out, healing a neighborhood just Martha never imagined her thyme sprigs would become Seattle's unlikeliest peace offering. That glass jar, once her grandmother's remedy for childhood scrapes, now sat on her kitchen counter like a silent judge, mocking her fear of becoming that lonely woman who hoarded kindness like expired coupons. Community garden potlucks had become battlefields of passive-aggressive casserole swaps, where side-eyes were served more generously than dessert. But Martha, with her creaky knees and stubborn hope, decided to try something reckless. She bundled thyme into tiny bouquets, tied them with twine, and left them on doorsteps with handwritten notes. For simmering soups, and shorter tempers. First attempts were clumsy. One bundle landed in a puddle, another was mistaken for weed by a skateboarding teen. Yet slowly, magic happened. A woman who'd glared over fence lines brought back Martha's jar, filled with homemade lavender honey. Another neighbor, notorious for stealing parking spots, left a thank-you card with a doodle of a thyme sprig wearing boxing gloves. Martha's hands shook as she placed last bundle on her own stoop, a quiet surrender to vulnerability. That jar, once a relic of past, now held something fiercer than herbs, proof that even decades-old roots could send up fresh shoots. Seattle's Feud fog lifted, one fragrant sprig at a time, lit not by grand gestures but by stubborn grace of a middle-aged woman who'd rather trip forward than stand still. Martha never planned to join Seattle's weirdest grassroots movement, but one damp Tuesday, she tripped over destiny, literally. A rogue thyme sprig escaped her overstuffed tote as she hurried past Pike Place Market, and before she could swipe it up, a woman in paint-splattered overalls scooped it with a grin. "This stuff's magic," she said, tucking it behind Martha's ear like a crown. "Changes flavors, and minds." Turns out, thyme was more than garnish. That woman, Rosa, ran a community garden where feuding neighbors traded snippy notes for snipped herbs. Martha, skeptical but charmed, signed up for next potluck. She arrived clutching her grandmother's glass jar, now cradling thyme sprigs like fragile peace treaties. Learning curve? Steep. Martha's first attempt transplanting seedlings ended with dirt in her bra and a sneezing fit. But Rosa's crew, a ragtag bunch of retirees, single moms, and one ex-lawyer who quoted Rumi while pruning, cheered every wobbly step. They taught her thyme's secret: its roots thrive when split and shared. So Martha got lit with purpose. She started slipping jars onto doorsteps where neighbors had stopped speaking. A sprig for couple who fought over parking spots, another for teen who blasted punk rock 3 a.m. Notes read, "Grows better with sunshine, and conversation." One jar landed with Mrs. Kwan, who'd been icy since Martha's dog dug up her peonies. Days later, a knock. Mrs. Kwan held out a pot of kimchi, thyme tangled artfully atop. "You're right," she said. "Things grow." By summer's end, Martha's jar was never empty, just refilled by hands she'd once only waved from across street. And that sprig behind her ear? Still there, brittle now, a reminder that even dried-out grudges could crumble into something new. Woman never planned to join Seattle's weirdest grassroots movement, but here she was, elbows deep in soil and social repair. That glass jar of thyme sprigs on her windowsill had started as a half-baked experiment, something to mask her neighbor's cigarette smoke drifting through shared vents. Now it sat like a cheeky middle finger to decades of passive-aggressive notes about parking spots and unreturned casserole dishes. 52 years of Midwestern politeness had trained her to swallow grievances like bad potluck potato salad. But time demanded action. Each sprig carried an unspoken ultimatum: use me or lose me. So she began bundling them with twine, leaving jars on doorsteps with handwritten cards, for simmering soups or simmering tempers. A ridiculous gamble, but cheaper than therapy. First attempts flopped. One neighbor mistook her offering for weed and called cops. Another tossed it straight into composting, which stung more than expected. Martha's knees protested as she crouched by her garden bed that evening, stubbornly yanking chickweed. Maybe bridging gaps required younger backs or thicker skin. Then Mrs. Kwan from Unit 3B brought back an empty jar, filled with kimchi. "Your thyme lit up my stew," she said, and just like that, Martha's kitchen became a swap meet for more than herbs. Bundles of mint traded hands for tamales, rosemary sprigs bartered for sourdough starters. Even Hank from 2A, who'd once keyed her Prius over a disputed recycling bin, left a six-pack of IPA with a post-it, "Time's up." By midsummer, community garden potlucks smelled less like grudges and more like garlic and laughter. Martha's jar stayed half full now, not from scarcity but because everyone kept planting their own. She watched a teenager teach Hank to braid garlic stems, his tattooed hands fumbling like a kid's. That glass jar had cracked something open, not just in her building, but in her. Turns out, healing tasted like thyme and poor decisions turned purposeful. Her lower back still ached. Her pruning shears still vanished mysteriously. But as Martha wiped dirt from her palms, she caught her reflection in jar, laugh lines deeper, shoulders lighter. Growth, she realized, wasn't about rooting out conflict. It was about making space for both weeds and wonder. Martha never planned to join Seattle's weirdest community feud, but here she stood on her sun-faded porch, clutching a glass jar of thyme sprigs like a grenade. Across street, Diane, queen of passive-aggressive compost critiques, glared from behind hydrangeas. 3 years of snide notes about dandelions, misplaced recycling bins, and whose rosemary crept over property lines had boiled into silence thicker than Puget Sound fog. Martha's hands trembled. 52 years of Midwest politeness screamed retreat, but something wilder whispered, "Life's worth capturing." She'd spent months perfecting her thyme rinse, steeped sprigs in rainwater, a splash of lemon, after reading how ancient Greeks used it for courage. Maybe it was placebo, maybe magic, but bottling it felt like bottling guts. She crossed street. Diane's eyebrows shot up. Without a word, Martha thrust jar forward. "For your aphids," she blurted. A tiny goof, Diane's hydrangeas were pristine. But then, a miracle, Diane sniffed, unscrewed lid, and smirked. "Smells like my grandma's kitchen." Cue twist, someone snapped a pic. By sundown, Time to Heal trended locally. Next morning, 6 neighbors left mason jars on Martha's stoop with handwritten tags, "For Henderson's barking dog stress." "For Park's teens exam anxiety." Even Mike, Block's resident skeptic who'd scoffed hippie potions, showed up sheepishly with a 6-pack of IPA and a request, "Think this'd work on my divorce rage?" Community garden potlucks became time-sharing hubs. Diane brought her famous blackberry crumble, admitting she'd misjudged Martha's invasive lavender. Crowd roared when Mike chugged a thyme-spiked smoothie and announced he'd hugged his ex Martha, now Seattle's accidental sage of neighborly peace, grinned. Who knew a $2 herb could turn NIMBY vibes into something so lit? Jar. Still half full on her windowsill. A reminder, courage, like thyme, grows back wilder when you cut it. Martha, 52, never planned to join Seattle's weirdest grassroots movement, but here she was, knees deep in thyme sprigs, turning feuds into friendships one fragrant jar at a time. What began as a desperate bid to silence bickering over backyard fences had blossomed into something lit, a time-sharing initiative, where neighbors swapped sprigs and stories instead of scowls. Her glass jar, once holding a single lonely stem, now overflowed with offerings from block after block, each sprig a tiny olive branch. Community garden potlucks became time-themed peace talks. Martha guided hesitant hands to crush leaves, inhale deeply, then laugh how silly old grudges seemed when your fingers smelled like sunshine and earth. A retired teacher traded her snipe about loud wind chimes for a cutting of lemon thyme. A young dad swapped his parking space rage for a jar of honey thyme syrup. Even postal worker, famous for scowling porch clutter, left with a sprig tucked behind her ear. Martha's odd habit, humming show tunes while bundling herbs, became neighborhood's accidental anthem. By summer's end, her jar sat center stage block parties, its contents thinning as connections thickened. Rivalries dissolved into recipe swaps, side eyes turned into shared sunsets over rosemary lemonade. Age hadn't sidelined her, it armed her with quiet power of knowing small things grow. That glass jar, now sticky with fingerprints and goodwill, proved it. Grab your thyme, sprinkle kindness where you're planted.